understands the law as I see it, I think that when council sees it, the environmental is a decision made by the LSRP or by the DEP. It is not a board decision. All the board can do, and I don't think it's over the board anyway, is condition any approval on our compliance with the LSRP or the DEP. But for information purposes, in order to try to answer questions of witnesses, I'll go out of order, the interested citizens, I'll go out of order and call up the LSRP. Thank you.
Please raise your right hand, sir. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
Yes.
Please state your name and spell your last name and your...
Craig Gendron, G-E-N-D-R-O-N.
Thank you.
What is your occupation, Mr. Gender?
I'm an environmental consultant,
And where do you provide your services?
primarily in New Jersey, New York, and throughout New England.
And for how long have you been practicing as an LSRP?
The program began in 2012. That's when the first licenses were allowed, and that's when I got my license. So I started with the LSRP program in 2012. And over that period and before that period, I've been practicing environmental consulting, again, in New York, New Jersey, and throughout New England for about 30 years.
From what school did you graduate?
I've got a master's in civil engineering with contaminated freight and transport from the University of Illinois, and I've got a Bachelor of Science in geological engineering from the Colorado School of Mines.
Are you a licensed remediation professional and also a licensed engineer of the state of New Jersey?
I am.
Can you briefly give the board the benefit of some of your experience as an LSRP?
Yeah, LSRP, like I say, it's since 2012 I've been managing sites in New Jersey. I've got probably a dozen right now active sites that I am responsible for. I've had over the years up to 20 at a time. And in addition to that, as I said, I've been practicing in New Jersey even before the LSRP program began. And I have dozens of sites that I've investigated and remediated. And that experience has stretched from the first phases of the site work, which are preliminary assessments, all the way through RAOs, which are response action outcome statements, which are the final documents for the sites.
And have you testified previously for zoning board?
I have.
Accepted as an expert?
Yes.
LSRP? Mr. Chairman, I submit that my witness is qualified as an LSRP and an engineer.
We'll accept your witness as an expert. Could you just state for the public what LSRP stands for?
Licensed Site Remediation Professional.
Everybody got that? That's what the LSRP is. Thank you.
What does an LSRP do?
Under the LSRP program and under the statute that enabled that particular program, the LSRP is given the opportunity to lead the investigation and remediation of impacted properties. So we're able to go forward with cleanups without DEP approval under most circumstances. There are places where if variances are required, then the DEP gets involved. And certainly when...
And I'm sorry, when he says variances, he doesn't mean variances before boards.
That's right, variance to the rules that guide the remediation program. So our role on these is to protect human health and the environment. That's our primary responsibility. And under the enabling regulations, there are opportunities for us, as I said, to proceed with this work without DEP pre-approval. And again, under circumstances where we vary from the regulations, that's when the DEP can get involved.
I want to reiterate. Your primary responsibility is to protect human health and the environment. Is that correct?
That's right.
What information and materials did you review prior to commencing your investigation?
On this particular site, we reviewed preliminary assessment work that had been done before we started. We reviewed site investigation information. That would be monitoring wells and soil boring information. We reviewed sandborne maps, historical aerial photos, topographic maps. All of that work was done before we engaged with the site.
And did you, would you give us a brief history of the property?
Yeah, the property up until about 1970, and that would be from the early 1900s to approximately 1970. Our research has shown that it was operated as a portion of the battery manufacturing operation. From about 1970 to close to 1980, the property was being demolished, building structures were being removed, and in about 1980, that's when the supermarket store, I forget which one started there, but that's when the supermarket was established. So the supermarket is Pathmark. The supermarket has been there from 1980 till the present under various names. As a piece of that supermarket store, there was a dry cleaning operation that was at one end of the supermarket.
And did you do a remedial investigation after being engaged?
Yes, we did.
And review what your remedial investigation revealed.
Yeah, first of all, the remedial investigation was completed and the report was issued to the DEP in May of 2017, so just for the record. But in general, we put in soil borings, we put in monitoring wells. Roughly 90 soil borings or wells have been installed across that property. Approximately 250 soil and/or groundwater samples have been collected over our tenure at this site. So through that information, we were able to investigate under the rules that guide our activities and delineate the various issues that we encountered at the site.
Is there historic fill in the property?
Yes, there is. The issues that we uncovered through that extensive investigation included site-wide historic fill. It included 2 areas of soil impacts that required remediation. And we also found 2 areas of groundwater impacts that are requiring remediation as well.
And just explain briefly for the benefit of the board and consider what is historic fill?
A historic fill has got a very specific definition within the technical regulations that guide the work that I do as an LSRP. Historic fill is fill that has been brought onto the property and in order to raise the grade to allow for eventual development. And a key aspect of that is if it's impacted and found to be impacted on a site, it needs to be impacted before it gets placed on the property. So this is not fill that's been impacted by site operations, it's fill that's been impacted before it was placed.
And does it require remediation?
If it's impacted and found to be impacted, yes.
And would the planned environmental remediation be compatible with residential development?
It's interesting, in the technical requirements for site remediation, which are the prevailing regulations that I'm bound to follow as an LSRP, there's a specific requirement regarding residential development on historic fill. And in general, the 2 requirements that are in place in order to allow for that development to happen are what they call presumptive remedies. And there's 2 things. There's engineering controls and there's institutional controls. On the engineering control side, that means putting in barriers, buffers and barriers in order to eliminate potential contact with the soil. Right? That's on the engineering side. On the institutional side, there are what they call classification exception areas that allow for the groundwater that's impacted by the historic fill to be there and be managed and be isolated from people actually intersecting it. So you can't put in drinking water wells, you can't excavate down to the water table and drink the water. Those are the requirements that allow for the development of sites like this to be placed on historic fill.
Was there fill removed from the site? Or soil removed from the site?
Yes, as part of the remedial actions that have already been undertaken at the site, there's been about 355 tons of petroleum impacted soil that was uncovered during the investigation. That has already been removed. There was about 6 tons of solvent impacted soil that associated with the laundromat that has been removed from the site. So those are the 2 actions that have been completed.
Is historic fill very prevalent in northern New Jersey?
Especially in northern New Jersey. There's historic fill maps that are available to the public that show where the DEP, even without any sampling data, has determined there to be the presence of historic fill. And the way they do that, they look at historical topo maps, they look at it over the years of development, and in areas where the grades have been raised a certain amount, those are the areas that they've identified as potential historic fill areas.
You talked about removal of a lot of soil. What remedial action remains to be completed?
Yeah. So the actions that remain at the site in order to get to closure under the LSRP program are severalfold. One, it's the historic fill, which needs to be managed so that it can accommodate the development and also be remediated in accordance with the regulations. That's one piece of it. Another piece of it are 2 areas of groundwater impacts that aren't under any of the existing or proposed, well, not under any of the proposed development areas, but they're groundwater impacts that remain on the site that need to be managed, monitored, and dealt with as well.
Was your company engaged to ensure compliance with all DEP requirements in order to proceed with construction and eventual occupancy of the building?
Yes, as part of my primary responsibility It's for this particular site and for any site of which I'm the LSRP. It's number one, as I mentioned, protecting the health of the environment, all the way through the end and through closure of these properties. So yes, in this case, that is one of my primary roles here, is to make sure as part of the closure of the property that it's available for the proper development which is planned here, and also to make sure through time it's monitored and closed in accordance with the rules.
In order to commence construction, does the DEP have to approve the project?
No, not through, and let me give some information around that. As I mentioned, we are putting in, and the plan is to follow the regulations in terms of what's required to move forward with residential development over the historic field. The regulations are very clear as to exactly what has to be in place, all the way down to thicknesses of barriers and buffers and demarcation layers, down to the kinds of permits that will be required in order to enable that particular type of development. So the plan is to follow the regulations to a T, monitor it by the LSRP to make sure it's done properly, not ask for any variances to the technical regulations, which is where the DEP would have to get involved. That's not the plan here. So up to the point that we're able to ensure that those engineering controls and the institutional controls are enabled. Once that's in place, development can proceed.
Okay, you indicated you want to ensure everything is complied with, so will you engage to ensure all necessary safeguards be complied with and all relevant regulations be followed?
Yes.
And when do you think the applicant can commence site work at the site? Site work at the site?
Yeah, the site work can begin, once the development plan is approved by, assuming it gets approved by the board, we'll have the information we need to then work with the civil engineers to make sure that the engineering controls are designed and implemented. Once those designs and implementation plans are in place, the process is that we develop a remedial action work plan that incorporates those necessary engineering controls. And we have to issue that 60 days before, to the DEP, 60 days before the actual construction commences. And that's the only time requirement.
And subsequent to that, when can actual construction of the buildings commence?
Yet, the construction of the buildings, the real issue there is you don't want to start the building construction until you verify that all the engineering controls are in place. Engineering controls, as I said, are specific thicknesses of buffers and barriers to ensure that the public and anybody else can intersect the historic fill. So once those foundations, walkways, landscape areas, those are the elements of the engineering control. Once those are all in place, inspected by the LSRP myself to make sure that they're exactly in accordance with the remedial action work plan, that's when the actual building construction can begin.
No further questions of this witness.
I assume that's it.
No. No.
You said there's more soil to be removed. Is there more soil to be removed, remediation to be done? Remediation to be done?
There's no more soil, under the plan that we have, there's no more soil that's impacted that is required to be removed. The plan is to leave the historic fill in place and provide the barriers and engineering controls that are required to allow for the development to happen without moving it off-site.
And you said approximately 355 tons has already been removed?
361, there was 6 of chlorinades and 355 of the petroleum.
What types of contaminations might you find in the historic fill?
Yeah, the historic fill is, like many sites that I've dealt with, especially in Essex County, there are a group of metals, typical metals, copper, zinc, all kinds of metals that are there. In addition, there's compounds called polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. And just as a little bit of context here, the rules don't even, if you have a site where you've identified historic fill, in this case we've got borings all over the property. We have it monitored from one end to the other, and we found historic fill on almost every single boring on the property. We know it's historic fill. It's got the exact signature of the way it's described in the regulations. It's got cinders, it's got ash, it's got demolition debris, it's got all of the things that classify, a lot of us classify as historic fill. So the site is full of it, all right? The where I was going with this is, if you've identified it visually, the rules don't even require you to sample in order to get closure of it. It's just assumed to be impacted, because there's been so many studies of it over the years, and it's so prevalent that it's not even deemed necessary to sample to figure out all of the constituents that are there. All that you do is you assume in the permit documents that it's impacted with metals and PAHs. That's what you can do.
Would the fact that the actual housing units are elevated aid in the fact that the housing units are elevated, would that aid in separating the dwellings from any potential contaminants?
Absolutely. The whole idea of what the DEP requires and we have to implement is separation, okay? It's separating the public from the historic fill. So whether it's foundations and subgrade, clean fill subgrade, or whether it's a walkway, pavers, and a foot of clean soil, or landscape barriers, which are all elements of this plan here, any one of those or all of those can constitute a barrier between the public and the impacted soil, which is the historic fill.
You say you took 250 soil samples, so you're not just assuming it's historic fill? Was there a chance that there's other contaminations, being it was a battery factory?
So, just to clarify, it was 250 total, so 125 soil, 125 water, just to get the record straight. But with all of that sampling there, we were looking for anything and everything at the property. So we didn't go there just to investigate historic fill. We went there to investigate whatever could have been discharged on that property.
How deep are your bores?
We've got a couple that are 40 to 50 feet deep. Most of them, because the water table there, if you're familiar with the area, 6 feet deep to water. So we don't have to go very far to figure out what's going on. So most of them are within 15 feet, 20 feet, a few that are down to 35 or 40 feet.
And out of those samples, was there anything that came to your surprise, anything out of the ordinary, or?
No, what we found is that the distribution of impacts in that historic fill layer, which is about 6 feet deep at this site roughly, was that it was ubiquitous. We didn't find hot spots of metals here and not over here. We found it over the entire site. Similar, arrangement of metals, similar arrangement of PAHs, which makes complete sense that this is historic fill issues that we're dealing with. So, does that answer your question?
Any other members?
I believe you said there were still 2 groundwater areas. Can you show me where they are?
Sure. So, I had mentioned also that there was, I'll do it here and then I'll do it there. How about
Just
that?
tell us what exhibit that is, so.
Exhibit A3. So there were 2 areas where we removed soil. I mentioned 6 tons roughly. That was over here. This was the former dry cleaner area. So there was about 6 tons of soil. I'm going to get to your answer. I'm describing what the source of those issues were that have been removed now. So it's about 6 tons of soil, of chlorinated soils that were removed there. Okay. So that was right around that area right there. And then there were 255 roughly tons of petroleum impacted soils that were removed right up in this area here, and I'll point it out near the board in a second, so up in that general area. Now, doing that to show you what up here was the petroleum. So that soil had to go, okay? It wasn't a historic fill that you can leave. It was impacts that were placed there, not purposely probably, but were there. Those soils have been removed here, the soils have been removed there, but before we got to them, because this probably happened decades ago, it left behind a signature of solvent impact, very dilute, but nevertheless above the very stringent standards that New Jersey has, that exists below this building here, okay, below the supermarket. Okay, no further, does not go off-site, stays in this area. Over time, that has been getting less and less in concentration, and it's moving in the right direction, so we're going to continue to monitor that. This area here Okay, what I just pointed out was the chlorinated area is right over here. I know it's kind of ridiculous, but that's what it is. The pointer's probably not that accurate. The other area, there's petroleum impacts here that I mentioned that have been removed. That area of impact extends down to kind of right where the concrete walkway is, so it's a smaller plume, but it's right over in this area here. I'm describing an area of petroleum impacted water that extends right in this general vicinity here. It's monitored by a number of wells. The sources, we believe, have been removed now. The water quality is improving since the removal, so we're going to continue to monitor and hope, not hope, but we're planning that that's going to naturally attenuate over time. So those are the two areas.
And you do have monitoring wells along that back property adjoining public service, right? Because
We do.
I know public service removed a large quantity
They
of
sure did.
contaminated
Yeah,
material a couple of, like 2-3 years
yeah,
ago.
yeah,
So that's monitored, that's monitored.
yeah. Do you need more on the board?
Yeah,
Okay.
next question. With excess drainage into that area, the last one you showed, would that seep down and then dissipate?
Excess drainage from what?
It was previously testified, I believe, that under that carport, they're going to be putting a flat curve so all the water from the parking lot will drain into that green area.
Yeah, I'm not 100% knowledgeable about the drainage that's going to happen there. The civil can certainly answer some of that information. As I understood it, it was going to go to a detention basin, subsurface detention basin, and then shuffle off-site. That's what I understood. So that wouldn't
But
impact.
they made a comment that they were putting in a flat curve to drain into that green area, just to,
Yeah, I'm
or
not.
the drainage should just go into the ground.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. From what you're describing, it's all pavement in that general area. It's going to remain pavement. It's going to be drained and controlled with a subsurface disposal system that will then lead to a drainage basin, which will lead off-site. So I'm not anticipating any issues.
That's how it was testified, and it said it was going to be a flat curve.
I'm not disputing that that may be the answer to what you described there, but what I'm saying is if it's that small area in that green area there that you're talking about, in my view, that probably wouldn't have any impact anyway. But that's definitely a question you might want to ask the civil engineer.
He's going to be my next witness. I've got to call him back on the traffic and the other issue you raised about the snowplow.
Roger, in terms of excavation, how do you handle the soil that is historic soil that needs to be excavated for the drainage of the foundations?
Yeah, that has to be sampled, classified, and discharged, yeah, disposed off-site properly. Absolutely.
Any other board members have questions of this witness? Does anybody in the public have questions for this witness? Let's start with Mr. Frantantoni.
Yes, sir, you said that, actually, the CME representative for the town, when he testified, he said there were environmental concerns, there was no NFA letter yet. Is there an NFA letter, or do you anticipate one?
No, the NFA letters left when the LSRP program began. So it had no NFA letter. There will be no NFA letter for the site. What there will be is a response action outcome statement, which I'll write. That's the RAO. That takes the place of a no further action.
And the New Jersey DEP, do they oversee? Do you have to report to them to get a report?
We have to issue reports to them, that's right.
Do they have any input on, do they actually, or they just take your word for it?
It's a complex question. If you stick with the regulations, and as I mentioned before, have no variances to the technical regulations, then I can guide the remediation. We have to issue them reports. They have an opportunity to come back and talk, but they still leave it up to the LSRP to guide the direction of the program. That's the Site Remediation Reform Act. That's what it was to enable, is speedier cleanup of these properties, and that's why they let us take the position of the regulator when it comes to making decisions on cleanup. I will say one more thing. In order to get closure of the site, to get this RAO that we're talking about, response action outcome, there will be permits required, okay? Those permits are issued by the DEP. So in order to get to that eventual closure of the site, the DEP will be able to weigh in because they can either give you the permit or they can't. So it's up to them to cooperate with the LSRP to get the permits so we can effect closure of the site.
How about the EPA, the federal
No,
environmental
they don't have
protection?
any jurisdiction on this particular
They're
site.
not involved in
No,
this
absolutely not.
site whatsoever. Now, you mentioned something in regards to one of the members' questions about that draining water into the green area. Then I thought you said that the whole area is going to be asphalt.
No, the green area that I was describing is an area that's mostly landscaped now, so that's not changing. What I was saying is, I don't know where exactly you were pointing, and maybe I was interpreting it wrong, but we were talking about this area of petroleum impacted water. Where that sits, it's all pavement above it now. And as I understand the development plan, and it's sitting here in front of us, that area is going to be paved in the future as well, so that's not going to change.
You used some technical terms about covering the historic film hall, but the word that the public knows is, you say we're going to cat.
It's a buffer and a barrier system. So there's a barrier on top. It could be landscaping, could be concrete, could be asphalt, could be foundation of a building. And then there's a buffer, which is clean fill. And then below the buffer, they actually tuck in what they call a demarcation layer. So that if anybody digs in the future, unknowledgeable to the LSRP, because we don't want to do that, they'll encounter this barrier material and know that they're now encroaching on the historic fill. So that's the system that's the general system, barrier buffer.
Would the general public, with some knowledge of that, would that be referred to as capping?
I've heard it called that before, yes.
And the other thing that's pave and wave, are you familiar with that
No,
term?
I've not heard that.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have any written information
Get your
regarding
state name, please, for the record.
David Yenua?
Thank you.
Do you have any written information for the board and the audience about what concentrations were found there of the various toxic metals and other things?
I don't, not with me today. Can I say? The document that we issued that has all that information is available to you. It's at the DEP's office, it's a public document.
Now, from what I'm gathering, the DEP won't be coming to supervise anything here.
They can inspect anytime they want, but I don't know
If they want.
if they want to.
But basically, I've heard the DEP mentioned several times by particularly the chairman, but the DEP isn't necessarily going to be coming. You're the site manager.
Yeah, with a couple of exceptions there. One, in order to get closure of the site, to get that response action outcome statement, we need permits, okay? Those permits require a submittal to the DEP, and they have to review the entire site. And at that point, they can issue, which we're hopeful they do, the permit for both the soil issues and the groundwater issues. So it's not entirely accurate that they're not involved. At that spot where the permit's required, they are.
So 90 borings were done, and some of them as deep as 60 feet? 40 feet?
Yeah, there are a couple, very few went that deep.
Is the contamination all of toxins all the way
No,
down?
absolutely not.
How far?
The historic fill is about 6 feet deep on the site. So that's the extent of the historic fill impacts. The soil, as I mentioned, we've already removed the soils that had to be removed that exceed standards that aren't associated with the historic fill. Those soils are gone. So, yeah, 6 feet.
So when the project is done, and a lot of the existing pavement will have to be removed,
In order to affect the development plan, as you see here, a large portion of the existing pavement will have to be removed.
and
That's right.
that's going to expose all of the toxic soil.
The historic
And
fill.
I'm gathering 6 feet deep.
Well, the historic fill will likely be encountered when they do site work and construction, absolutely.
So won't that be a hazard to the construction workers themselves?
Well, properly mitigated through site controls, through personal protective equipment, through plans that have to be written in advance of them doing that work, we're gonna mitigate any impacts to the workers.
So when they have the heavy machinery going in there to do some of the work, isn't some of that dirt going to be flying up in the air and floating around in the air where these residents live?
And that's part of, that's a great question. That's part of there's a soil management plan that is part of the remedial, I'm not gonna lose you here. It's soil, I know. There's a soil management plan that's inserted as part of the remedial action work plan. That's the document that I mentioned had to go in 60 days before the actual work can begin. Okay? So that soil management plan is meant to address issues that you're describing here. Dust, whatever. Any tracking material on and off site, all that would be mitigated by that plan.
You mentioned the development plan. You said once a development plan is approved. Hasn't the board already approved a development plan? A redevelopment? You've already approved one, right?
Well, they've approved the plan, the redevelopment plan, but this is the application based on that redevelopment plan. So this is a site plan application, we're looking for site plan.
So you
I may not use
you mean
the approval of the application, how about that? Is that a little
So
more
it's a
accurate?
new development plan? Okay.
Technically, it's not new, but it's the new application.
Can you name some of the pollutants that are in the soil there?
Sure. There's, in historic fill, okay, there's certain metals. There's copper, there's zinc, there's nickel. Those come to mind. I can't name all of them, but those.
How about arsenic?
Yeah, there's probably some
How
arsenic.
about lead?
I imagine that there's some lead.
Mercury?
I'm not sure about that.
Thallium?
Yeah. Heavy metals have a range of concentrations that are even allowed for pure residential development in contact. So having just some of those compounds in the soil doesn't necessarily mean that it's a hazard. So when I'm citing that there's some metals there, I'm not saying to you that every one of those exceeds the standards. So there are metals there, that's for sure.
Okay, I think that's about all I wanted to ask you, except that the grassy areas and where all the trees are going to be, how are you going to have a tree growing or grassy areas and not have some of the toxins escaping from those particular locations?
Yeah, the DEP, as I mentioned, in the way that they fashion the regulations to account for this kind of development over historic-ville, it's very prescribed. They're called presumptive remedies. They've gone so far as to identify the actual separation around a root ball for a tree, how much clean fill needs to be all the way around the root ball in order for it to be allowed. So that's how landscaping can happen, and there not be any connection between the public and the historic fill. It's down to that level that the regulations specify, that barrier and buffer system.
So right now you're working on 12,
I've got 12 active cases
and
right
they're
now.
all, like this, polluted?
There are a
sites?
variety of things, but yeah, every one of them is a case, meaning that there's an environmental impact.
And you've done many dozens, hundreds,
Probably, yeah.
and this is New Jersey.
Yeah.
So all of this is a major problem in New Jersey.
I do work all over the place. So I don't know that New Jersey and the sites that I look at, I can really sit and say, right here as I stand, that it's the worst. All right, they certainly have their impacts. I've got similarly impacted properties that I deal with in Connecticut, in New York, in Vermont. Think about Vermont, that's not a place that you gravitate to and think that it's
But
gonna
New
be
Jersey's like the most polluted state in the country.
I can't speak to that, I don't know.
I think that's all I can think of.
Mr. Sheldon?
Good evening again, Michael Sheldon, 47 Floyd Street. Mr. Gendron, you have mentioned a few times that the historical fill on the site typically is about 6 feet vertically.
In that range.
Right. When this case first came before the planning board, a year or so ago, and there was just discussions about declaring it an area needing redevelopment, it was mentioned that the total extent of the contamination on the site occupied a square area of about 10 acres. Now, it sounds like you're going to need to remove 6 feet of soil over an area of 10 square acres, and if you do the quick calculation, that turns out to be about 3 million cubic feet of dirt, or about 100,000 cubic yards. Now, typical commercial dump truck has a capacity of about 14 cubic feet. You're looking at,
Mr. Sheldon, he never testified he had to remove that dirt.
he did say that there are areas where the historical fill would need to be removed, about 6 feet in depth.
I didn't say that.
Definitely not.
So you're not gonna, you're gonna,
No.
you're gonna cap that,
We're putting in a buffer and a barrier system over the historic fill. That's what I said.
so that would be, essentially is a concrete barrier that would be
No,
at grade?
it's not concrete. In some places, it's concrete because it's a foundation. In other areas, it's landscaping, okay? In other areas, it's pavement. So it's a variety of measures that constitute the engineering controls which the DEP mandates for sites just like this.
I guess I have to defer to your expertise, but the type of other barriers that you're suggesting just don't, unless it would be concrete, I don't see how that would be a permanent obstacle for some of these toxins and carcinogens to eventually leach their way out of the ground. It sounds like you're just going to put different types of sand and plastics to try to contain these very serious pollutants in these
Yeah.
toxins.
Let me see if I can answer it this way. So after the barrier system and the buffer system are installed, whether it's concrete or whether it's pavement or pavers or landscaping, there's going to be maintenance of those features that are going to be required. I keep bringing up this permit. Permits that'll be required that the DEP will have a hand in writing, in fact, they write them, mandate operation and maintenance of these engineering controls. That's how you mitigate. So if you're out there, you inspect the pavement, let's say annually, any issues crop up, you fix cracks, you repair pavement, you do whatever it takes to make sure that that engineering control continues to operate the way it was intended.
I'm glad you mentioned maintenance, but I'm going to address that in a second. Would you say that the best type of barrier, without having any future risks, the best possible barrier would be a concrete cap compared to different types of fill or
No.
plastic barriers?
No, absolutely not.
Concrete is not the best type of barrier?
No. For instance, concrete doesn't wear well for drive aisles. It depends on site use. I mean, there's certain areas of the site where that will work fine. In fact, foundations of buildings would be better out of concrete than out of pavement. But areas where there's parking, you're going to be adjusting, you'll want to do utility work down the road. It's much easier to deal with going through some pavement than it is through some concrete.
Perhaps Mr. Gassion will object that I'm giving testimony rather than asking questions, but it turns out that there are a number of academic journals dealing with this type of engineering problem, and I came across an article from a journal called Remediation. It's entitled Hazardous Chemical Site.
Why don't we swear you in if you're going to give this?
Sure, if I could just, I wanted to just read one little relevant thing into the record, if you don't mind.
This is time for questions. Just gonna read
Well, it has a
the
bearing on what Mr. Gendron just said about these types of barriers. If this is important for everyone to hear. If I could just read a brief section in the record, I would appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to object to the section in the record for something.
I'll submit it into evidence. I'll give this to the chair.
Well, at the end, you would be able to do it, so to save time, why don't we swear you in
All right.
on this, because it is not a question. And I understand council's objection, which is correct, but to save time, we'll let you do
I
this.
think if I may, my other objection is what basis upon which do we take
Well,
this kind of information? How do we know it's valid
Yes, Chair.
information?
Yes, Chair.
I've qualified my LSRP very carefully, qualified to talk about this. We don't know where this is
I'll
coming
instruct
from.
the board to give whatever weight it needs. Remember,
This is
my
a record
position
journal.
on this, my position on this is that this is background material for the board, since we do not have jurisdiction. And we'll consider this paragraph that you're reading as more background information.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
So this is a journal called Remediation. The title of it is Hazardous Chemical Site Remediation through Capping. problems with long-term protection. I just want to read two little sections of it. Those familiar with landfill caps know that they are at best only postponed when future groundwater pollution will occur by leachable waste constituents in contaminated soils or waste management units that are capped as part of the site remediation. While in-place capping of waste in contaminated areas is certainly one of the least expensive short-term approaches for hazardous chemical site brownfield remediation, it carries with it potentially significant long-term issues that should and must be addressed in developing a properly remediated site. In the last part of the paragraph, one of the most significant problems associated with on-site waste or contaminated soil management using capping as a remediation approach is that funds for maintenance, this is why Mr. Gendron brought maintenance, funds for maintenance of the cap are only assured for 30 years. The magnitude of the 30-year post-closure funding is typically not adequate to replace the cap should deterioration proceed at a rate faster than expected. While in virtually all waste management units, the waste will be a threat for far beyond 30 years, there is no assurance that funds will be available to continue to maintain the cap, monitor the groundwaters, and provide for remediation of polluted groundwaters when the pollution occurs. In most situations, the waste will be a threat effectively forever. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. You're more than happy to have this. I'll give this as part of the record.
Obviously, I can.
Well, now would not be the right time to do that. When you get up and sum up, we'll
I will. Thank you.
consider that.
Any other questions of the public?
I just would like to follow up on my witness and respond to that, if we could.
What was the question? I'm just trying to
Well, you
make sure I
said
answer
that
whatever the
you
question is.
mentioned that there would be a maintenance program to
Yeah.
make sure that these barriers and buffers would be maintained, but as this article points out, that most projects only have a short-term facility to guarantee maintenance, that after a decade, in some cases 3 decades, the developer and whatever walk away and the site is allowed to fare on its own. And that's when all the fun begins. That's when all the contamination that's been harbored for 2 or 3 decades now is released.
What's your question?
I think his question was, if the 30 years, there's still going to be money to maintain it. Right, Mr. Sheldon? Is that what you're asking?
I would like assurance that they have a commitment for perpetuity as long as they're well, I mean, I know that sounds
I
absurd.
think the article stated landfill. This is in a landfill.
Well, it's a barrier, barriers by their nature will fail. And whatever barriers they're planning, they're not going to last forever. At some point in time, maybe not in our lifetimes, but our kids or our grandkids' lifetime, these barriers will fail.
Mr. Sheldon, can I interject a second?
Sure.
You may have a point, a valid point. My father was a chemist.
Mhm.
We would build nowhere. We'll knock everybody's house down and we'll remediate the soil underneath our homes. There's radon gases. I'm sure if I dump, I live on the Route 10 estates, that farmer may have dumped his motor oil under where my home is. We're never going to remove all the contaminants that are in New Jersey's land. So if we're going to follow the guidelines of the DEP, and we have assurance that the developer is going to do the right things within those guidelines, we could stay here till midnight debating this. There's no assurance he could give, there's no assurances 30, 40, 50 years down the road for anything. He could say it.
I wouldn't say it, trust me.
He could say it. It's smart
The last
enough.
thing I'd say is send somebody to perpetuity.
To me, listen, in my opinion, as a board member, when I look at things that are contaminated, and I've done a little work around contaminated sites, you have to take the law as it's written and have some, faith in the government's control of these dangerous substances. He's already commented that these substances aren't even at a level where they are a contaminant. They're a brownfield at best, at something. Listen, I've worked in the dirt for 40 years. I'm sure I've handled toxic stuff without knowing it. I'm fine. And so if we're gonna take that approach, your approach, that which to me is an extreme approach, we will build nothing anywhere. And then don't complain when the town looks like it does, because we just won't build anywhere. Belleville's an industrial town. I hear it all the time. So that means we can't build anything anywhere.
I just want it to be understood, I'm not opposed to development, Belleville certainly needs it, but I just don't want what seems to many of us to be a bandage being put on a very seriously contaminated site.
That's not true, it's not seriously contaminated. He already testified that they took out the most dangerous chemicals some years back. And many years
Some motor
back,
oil
Cooper
and some chlorinated
Industries
soil, right,
took
yeah.
out tons and dirt on the other side of what was that property on Howard Street.
But the historic fill still contains all sorts of very serious metals and metalloids.
The developer has to follow state regulations and standards. If we don't have any faith in that, then we're never gonna move forward.
Well, so
Sir,
at what
would you
cost?
comment on I thought the principal question was whether or not there is a deterioration of the barrier. If you could address that.
Yeah, I mean, and this goes back to the O&M, there's natural deterioration, there's drive aisle wear that happens, and all those things under the plan, the operation, maintenance, and monitoring plan, which is incorporated into the permit, which lives on forever, the permit does, those requirements will never leave, so there's always going to be inspections of the pavement, inspections of the concrete, inspections of the site, and any repairs that are necessary are going to be required to be made. One thing I'll point out, that if the basis of that article there is on landfill, it sounded like that's maybe the source of some of the information there. This is not a landfill. Landfills are characteristically organic issues. Over time with caps, degradation happens, volatilization happens, leachate gets developed. That's not what happens with
I don't know
historic
if you're
fill.
familiar with the history of the site, but there was a lake there. It was during the history of the Edison battery plant that Silver Lake got filled in by all of his waste material. So this is a landfill.
Well, we can find it, so, and we put in 200 some odd investigation locations.
There was a lake there. It's well documented. If you have access to Dr. George Hill's book.
I object now. The witnesses testified, he tested it and didn't find that.
I think we have enough background information on this. Thank you.
Jeff Mattingly, 56 Walnut Street, Belleville. I have a copy here of the information on file with DEP on this property from the preliminary investigation from those monitoring wells and ground samples. Iron, aluminum, mercury, arsenic, lead, manganese, nickel, sodium, beryllium, thallium, up to 150 times the amount of allowable amounts in groundwater and earth in this area. The historic use of this property was of a magnitude that...
Again, this is completely...
No, I'm asking a question, excuse me, please don't interrupt me regularly and
Well, you're
you know,
testifying.
you tend to harass people asking questions. No,
You're not asking
what,
questions.
can you
Let him
tell
finish
me,
his
please, what the historic use of this property as known by you in your investigation, you know, dating back to the turn of the last century, and I don't mean 2000, 1900. What was the historic use of this property?
Yeah, and I testified to that it was battery operations, battery manufacturing operations.
In chemical works?
Yeah, associated with battery manufacturing? Could have
No,
been.
in chemical
Okay,
works.
all
Yeah,
right.
no, I'm just
Yeah.
surprised, only
Yeah.
because the professional that the board that hired to report also neglected to mention the historic use of, and the record that was on record with the DEP of this property, this subject property. So the historic use was the battery manufacturing and chemical works of the Edison Corporation.
And I'm familiar with the operations, and the operations did not end on this property. They extended to other properties as well. So when you talk about operations at the battery or chemical working operations, it was a mixture on both properties. So it's hard to say exactly what happened on this piece of the property. What I can say is, with all the investigation locations that we put in there, hundreds of samples that we collected, we could not link any of the impacts that we found to anything with the metals that you just described there, and PAHs and things, to anything but the historic fill. There were no hot spots. We put borings exactly where some of the old buildings were.
But you're also talking about groundwater, and this
All I'm
is a
talking about
water
soil
table.
and groundwater.
Right, but if we're talking about historic pollution, this goes far and beyond potentially any fill. if the pollution was generated on the property, and then the water table, which we are very close to, as you have pointed out, it is not high above the water table, and it was a lake, Silver Lake. This was it, and the Edison plant and manufacturing chemical company.
Again, here we go. This is nothing but testimony.
It is the history of the use of property, and I'm getting to the point of,
Just
is
give me
this
a second.
appropriate for capping? Or should this be completely considered as remediation only, and perhaps no residential be allowed on property that has a magnitude of carcinogens and water contamination that, when you're talking about buffers and barriers, potentially, shrubs, you're talking about, history of, this is historic pollution that it really is just unbelievable.
Can we get a question?
Well, I just did. Is this appropriate
Yes,
to put
it is.
residential
Yeah.
on this property
And a lot
with
of
barriers of?
Let him answer the question.
Will you please yeah, well, if you would be quiet, we could get to the point.
No, I won't.
Now, let's be civil here, please.
Well, I think it's harassment.
It's not harassment. Let him
Let
answer
him
your
answer the
question.
question.
Do you think this site could be built on? With
Absolutely.
your 250 sample, how many borings did you say you took?
60 borings, 80 borings, somewhere in that range.
And out of those 80 borings, have we found hot spots or
No.
high levels of contamination other than historic fill?
It's ubiquitous, and that's part of what I'm hearing, and that is exactly the way it's characterized at the site there. The site-wide, the historic fill, it's very obvious if you look at the borings there. Bricks, cinders, glass shards, everything that you would expect in historic fill.
I'm extremely concerned with the water pollution.
And we've got a whole network of monitoring wells out there, so
Right,
now,
but what is that? I mean, you're speaking a lot to the borings, and when you're talking about
Well-
crushed debris that was used as landfill, that is not, that isn't making my point, which is the pollution, it rises and lowers with groundwater, right, raising and lowering, diffuses, like you said, it does diffuse, but it also remains there. And that, when you're
Is
putting
there a
shredding-
question, Mr. Manager?
Yes, would
Would
you
you ask?
please stop harassing me and let me ask you?
Continue to object.
Am I wasting your time?
Testify.
You have to excuse me if you think this is
You're
wasting
supposed
your
to
time.
be asking a question.
I am
All you're
asking a
doing is
question.
testifying.
Let your expert answer,
Yeah.
Mr. Gates.
there are impacts, as I mentioned, from chlorinated solvents. We're monitoring those and we're managing those. There are impacts from petroleum soils that have now been removed, and we're monitoring them and we're managing them. There are also impacts related to historic fill. The way the state of New Jersey allows those to be managed is through institutional controls. It's making sure that that site is never intersected with a drinking water well where somebody can
No
actually...
one's going to drink the water, of course.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
And it makes my job a lot easier when that's the case, but...
But then if that water were to raise up toxins and when you get close to ground level and you're talking about having shrubs and things of that nature as
It's
a
not that
barrier.
shallow. The groundwater table doesn't rise to that level.
Well, it does on occasion. I mean, my house is in Belleville. I'm 6 feet down in the ground. Sometimes the water level comes
Mr.
up in
Bagley,
cracks
is
in
there
the
a
middle of the
question?
floor.
Is there
The
a
water
question?
table rises very high on
Is
occasion.
there a question?
There is.
What is the question?
Do you think that those barriers would be suitable if these things were to percolate up to a level
Yeah.
where they could become airborne? Those
Uh,
historic, not
Yeah, and that's a good,
ground?
no, what you brought up is a good point. because
Well,
that
thank
may-
you. Did you hear that?
Did you let him answer the question?
Please.
So when you mention airborne, the kinds of chemicals you described there, the heavy metals, which are what you described, PAHs, those are not volatile compounds. Those are not ones that,
Arsenic?
no, that either. That is not a volatile compound. It tends to stay absorbed to the soil matrix. So that's not an issue. All of
Can
those.
he answer the
yeah.
question without you
All of
interrupting him?
So, step outside.
So issues of airborne, that's not the issue we're addressing by the remedy here. That's not a concern.
So you feel then that this is appropriate to capsulate that pollution?
It's
and not have it be
appropriate.
a hazard to those who could potentially live on a former industrial site, Mr. Gassion?
I do believe so, and we're following, just so you know, the exact requirements of the regulations for this exact situation. So by following the regulations, which are designed to be protective of public health and the environment, I am convinced that this is the right remedy.
I wish I could agree with you. Is this
Just
the
one more
last?
question, because our reporter needs a break, otherwise we'll get back.
Well, it's a follow-up, and that is, you're going to be on site supervising the remediation?
As LSRP, I'm responsible for supervision, so I may not be on site all the time, but there'll be eyes and ears will be out there to observe and make sure that the work is done in accordance with the plan.
So would you admit that this is not going to be a cleanup?
Admit.
This is only encapsulation. That's what you have planned.
Well, no.
You're not taking out the 6 feet of contaminated soil? You're just going to put something on top, a barrier on top?
This is in the definition of the work that we're doing. This is remediation. That's what this is.
So back in 1980, when they paved over the whole area, no cleanup was done, they just put pavement there. So then now, all these years later, it was almost 30 years later, here we are looking at another development on the location. And we're just going to encapsulate it again, leaving the contaminants, the toxins there.
They
Right?
took out over 300 yards of
Yeah,
material.
I mean,
already, 30 yards, right?
Yeah, we're
but
not
if you
done.
took- If you took it all out, it would be 3 million cubic feet.
That wouldn't make sense, would it?
What?
That wouldn't make sense, would it?
That may be part of the reason why the DEP
It would be
developed
a-
those regulations.
It would be a final solution to finally
No,
get that
it
stuff
wouldn't,
out of
because, down the street, there's another lot.
Look, you
It could be
guys,
someone's backyard, that's leaching the same thing out. This is the point that I'm trying to make. We could spend weeks here going over this. If the state allows it, and they're gonna, comply with the state laws, we're just beating a dead horse. We could just keep going over this. The state will not allow housing to be built on contaminated soil. And if they do, you should go down to Trenton and take it up with your
the
assembly.
DEP used to have people that were sent out to sites, and Christie did away with all this.
Yeah, because we need to develop.
So
We need
now
to keep
they're
moving
allowing
forward.
these paid professionals, but paid by the developers to say everything
But that's
is,
not the issue.
everything
here
is
before- listen,
A-OK,
that's not the
and
issue.
you're buying into it.
It's not the issue before the planning board. It's not. It's not a
It's not a
contaminated site.
concern, right?
Listen, it could be in our backyards, how would we know? Did anybody ever soil sample your home?
You work near contaminated sites, and look at you, right?
Right, I'm perfectly.
Have you got a
okay.
blood test?
Listen.
All right,
we
if
live
there's
in-
no
we
further
live in an
questions of the
industrial
public
state.
at this
That's
time,
it.
we're gonna give our,
One short follow-up question.
We could still ask questions after the break, right?
not at this, we want to finish up this witness and give our stenographer a break.
So when I asked you, you said that you'll be doing it, the DEP will not come out to inspect it. That was your
They may.
answer.
I can't say that they will or they won't. They run their own schedules.
Well, Mr. Conte, I just want you to pay attention, DEP ain't coming out here.
Who cares
They'll
if
leave it up
they
to
do?
him.
Who says a
They'll leave it up-
bureaucrat from
Well,
Trenton is
I'll-
any better than this man?
I'll
right here?
answer you at testimony at the proper time.
That's not what he said. He said he doesn't know.
DEP would come out.
Yeah, well, look, the testimony I give, I just want to tell you, you
I
created,
understand, I'm paying attention. I
just for the
heard that.
record, in case this ever goes to court, you're creating yourself a conflict of interest.
I'm not creating any conflict of anything.
If we have no further questions in this witness, we're going to take a short 5-minute break for our stenographer.
Frank Fleischman, 132 Franklin Street. So, in your professional opinion, you are looking at an in situ remediation as opposed to an ex situ remediation for this property?
Not exactly. There's a couple areas of groundwater impacts, okay, that are still being managed. The final plans for them are not 100% complete at this point. All right, so I wouldn't say that that's the final remedy. We're hopeful that natural attenuation will do a job on that. We think it probably will. The rest of this is, ex situ and in situ, that isn't the way that I use the terminology. In situ remediation for organic compounds, typically there's amendments you add and it biodegrades and that's how the remediation is effective. So I'm not 100% connected. I think you understand what we're doing there. It sounds like you do anyway, so.
Are the question is going to be, you've been doing this even before the LSRP
Oh,
program.
way before, yeah.
Okay. To your knowledge, has there ever been a failure of a capping system or a buffer barrier system that you speak of?
I don't have any sites where that's happened. As I said, they all come with maintenance plans, so we do have to do maintenance. Some sites have fences that are part of that engineering control, some have pavements, so we have to go back in and actually seal some of the pavement in some instances. So there's a variety of O&M activities that are put in place to make sure that they don't fail, don't have a catastrophic failure.
You said that about 300 cubic yards, was it?
Tons.
Tons was removed. Do you know when that might have happened?
2016 and 2017, across those 2 years. And the plans that describe that ad nauseum, the remedial action reports, are filed with the DEP. So they're already in the public domain.
Are you familiar with the Edgewater quantum remediation at Honeywell?
No.
I guess my final question, this will be my final question, I promise. With the contaminants that are there now, arsenic, lead, that sort of thing, do you feel that keeping that historical fill is safe? Is the chemical going to break down, turn it to gas, go through the barrier? Is there any danger of that?
No, these compounds are terribly stable, okay? And that's part of the nature of historic fill, and that's why the DEP has allowed them to be managed safely. That's what the rules are required to do, is provide a safe remedy, and that's what we're following. So it's because these things are pervasive. They're going to be there in perpetuity.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Gassion, you have another witness?
I do.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Okay.
Thank you. Mary Higgins, 148 Brighton Avenue. This is going to seem a rather simplistic question without all the chemical rhetoric, but
Good. Looking forward to
one
that.
of the common ways to assess the toxicity of the soil is to test colonies of earthworms that burrow down below the frost line. They can go further than 6 feet down to test if the soil is viable, for example, for growing shrubs, trees, all those plants there. Was that done?
No.
Why not?
We're not required to do that. And with regard to the shrubbery and that, that's going to be built in the buffer and barrier system, so it's going to be above the historic fill.
Oh, just out of curiosity, this is what I asked it. I guess you're familiar with the American Legion across the street from there, the American Legion Hall?
Okay.
Because next to the American Legion Hall, I believe the town owns a lot there. And if you go by there, Belmont Avenue, you're familiar with Belmont Avenue,
Yes.
right? There's always weeds growing there, and the American Legion complains to the town. The town's really good about going and taking the weeds and the saplings out, and they clean it up. Now, when you go into that parking lot, what do you see? You see any weeds grow, any healthy weeds there? Nope. Any saplings? There's nothing growing there on the dirt. There's maybe some brown scrub grass. And the reason I asked this question about the earthworms is that you expect people to live there, but earthworms can't. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins.
Would you like to answer that question?
Well, the plan is residential, so, but, yeah, we expect there to be some people there.
We have no further questions of the public from this witness, Mr. Gassion.
Mr. Spurgoy,